Who here had heard of Lucretius before this was sort of advertised? Just out of interest. Wow, that's fantastic. I might get some of you up later to just finish off the talk for me. But that's great, because my view is that he is one of, if not the, most underrated of Roman poets. Indeed, in terms of Roman poetry, he's the one we know probably the least about. Now, there's something appropriate about that, because as a follower of Epicurus, Epicurus, fragment 86, advises his followers, "Late biosas," which those of you who have Greek will know means live unknown, live in obscurity. And it seems Lucretius took the teachings of the master very seriously, because we know very little indeed about his life. In fact, his name, Titus Lucretius Carus, only comes down to us because of a manuscript. Here is the earliest manuscript of Lucretius. This manuscript is called O, and when I was first studying for this, I thought O must stand for something really romantic and mysterious, origin or something like that. Actually, O stands for oblongus, and if you can work out why it's called oblongus, there's a prize at the end. But this text dates to the 9th century and is in a lovely hand called Carolingian minuscule. And with one exception that I'll talk about at the end of my speech, this is the earliest text we have of Lucretius. And it's an interesting one because of this line here. So, tant elementa, and then there's something happened there, which we'll talk about in a minute. Per mutato ordine solo. And the thing that's interesting about this line is Lucretius here is talking, using an analogy for atoms. And he's saying, just as the letters in a word can be rearranged to make different words, so atoms, depending on their arrangement, can make different compounds and shapes and materials. And he's using the example of, disordered words. And the reason that's quite ironic is whoever was originally copying this text made a mistake. And you can see that the mistake is corrected up here. So the person who was copying this realized this didn't make sense. Elementa que uni, maybe, per mutato ordine solo. And so corrected it correctly, by the way, to quaint. Now, what's interesting is we know who did that correction. It's a monk called Dungal of Bobbio. And things that are interesting about Dungal of Bobbio. Firstly, he was a monk, teacher, astronomer, and poet. Secondly, he has his own Wikipedia page. And thirdly, we know more about Dungal of Bobbio than we do about Lucretius. But I find it, as I say, interesting that in a line that was about disordered words, there is actually a mistake that was corrected. So what do we think we know? And the answer is very little. There's a fighting chance that Lucretius was born in 94 BC, and there's a fighting chance that he died in 53 BC, which was Virgil's 17th birthday. The only contemporary reference we have to Lucretius is in a letter of Cicero. So it's to his brother Quintus, and it's dated February 54 BC. And in the letter, Cicero says they've been chatting about Lucretius, and Quintus has talked about his poems, and he says, multis luminibus ingeni, multae tamen artis. So Quintus is saying that Lucretius is very talented, he's got sort of raw poetical power, but also he's very skilled, he's a good craftsman. And it'll be interesting to see if you agree with that assessment as we get into it. But that's it. Everybody else is silent on him. And what's peculiar about that is he's massively influential. So if you read Virgil's Aeneid, somebody who clearly has no social life has calculated about 1 in every 19 lines of Virgil's Aeneid is an echo of Lucretius. So he's massively influential, yet we know almost nothing about him. There is a story reported in St. Jerome that Lucretius wrote the poem in brief intervals of sanity, having been driven mad by a love potion administered by his wife. And eventually he committed suicide. Now, there are reasons to doubt that that's true. However, there are things that might have prompted that story. So there are certainly signs that the work as we have it is unfinished. And there are things in the work that the ancient biographer may have thought pointed to an obsession. The work is addressed to the goddess Venus, and Book 4 famously deals with the irrationality of love. And ancient biographers really enjoyed suggesting that authors died in a manner befitting the content of their work. So, for example, if you read the life of the poet Euripides, he is torn apart by hunting dogs, mysteriously, just like one of his characters. So, on the whole, we don't tend to believe what ancient biographers tell us about how people died, because it's just all a bit too convenient. There is one exception, and it's the only ancient biography I believe, and it is the story of the death of the poet Aeschylus. And I'm looking around the room to see if there are any Terry Pratchett fans here. Any Terry Pratchett fans know how the poet Aeschylus died?
Well, I don't know about Terry Pratchett, but I think that it was, didn't a bird drop a stone on his bald head?
Very, very close. He was sitting by the side of the road, and an eagle flying over the head looked down and assumed that the bald top of his head was a rock.
Yeah.
And if you're an eagle trying to eat a tortoise, the best thing you need to do is drop it on a rock, because it cracks the shell open and then you can eat the delicious tortoise. And so I think the really credible story is that Aeschylus was killed by a low-flying tortoise. So other things we know about Lucretius. So he is the author of the poem De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, or on the nature of the universe. And this is a poem in hexameter verse, and I'll talk about that in a minute, which outlines the atomic theory of the Greek philosopher Epicurus. When I say hexameters, Latin poetry is a bit like music, and so it's composed of 6 bars, and in those bars you have 2 different rhythmical options. You can either have 2 long syllables, so in music a bit like sort of crotchet, crotchet, or you can have a long syllable and 2 short syllables, so in music a bit like crotchet, quaver, quaver. So in very crude terms, you can either go bum bum, or you can go bum bum, and that's how the rhythm works. You've got 6 bars to do that. So it's a hexameter poem. It's about 7,500 lines long, and it's divided into 6 books. And when I say books, I don't mean like this. This is what we would call a codex. I mean 6 papyrus rolls. And that's going to be relevant for something we talk about later on. But I do find it fascinating the way the technology of reading has come full circle, because the technology of reading began with scrolling, then moved to the codex, and has now returned to scrolling. So it shows there's nothing new under the sun. So what are these 6 books about? Well, books 1 and 2 outline Epicurus' atomic theory. And the key points here are that matter is neither created nor destroyed, and is composed of atoms and void, space. There are infinite atoms, which are constantly moving and occasionally swerving. Everything we see is created by the collisions and compounds of atoms. The universe is infinite and contains many other worlds, none of them created by the gods. That's books 1 and 2. Book 3 then moves on to consider the mortality of the soul, and in particular there is an extremely vivid diatribe against the fear of death, and we'll return to that later on. In book 4, he moves on to consider thought and sensation, including love. Love he regards as irrational. Sex is pleasurable. Love is irrational because you imagine that you can only derive that sex from one particular person, and it makes you unhappy if they're not around. And again, that may be why the biographer felt his wife had been dosing him. Book 5 contains information about the origins of the world and civilization, and there's an uncanny prefiguring of Rousseau's social contract theory in there. And then book 6, the final book, ends with a consideration of natural phenomena and disasters, and that's the end of the book, and that's the end of the entire poem. The poem is addressed to somebody called Gaius Memmius, and he is possibly the most unlikely choice for someone you should have addressed this poem to, partly because he was a very prominent politician, and as I've said, followers of Epicurus believed in abstaining from public life, keeping under the radar, living unknown. Whereas Memmius, who was the praetor in 58 BC and a consular candidate in 54 BC, was a high-profile politician. As often happens with high-profile politicians, some of them MPs for Hillingdon, things went wrong, and in 52 he was convicted of corruption and sent into exile. It's fair to say that Lucretius' poem may not have won him over to Epicurus' cause. We know this because in 51 BC, Cicero writes him a letter asking him not to demolish Epicurus' house just because he's fed up with all of the offensiuncula, little slights that the Epicureans have sent his way. Why he owned Epicurus' house, we don't know. Why he was in a position to demolish it, we don't know. But it's a fair bet that De Rerum Natura hadn't converted him. So why choose him as an addressee of the poem? Well, potentially because Venus was the patron goddess of his family. And potentially because if you want to do something, why not choose the hardest person to convert? A bit like Andrew Adonis' listening tour around the country on Brexit. If you want to convince someone of something, go and find the person least convincible, and if you can convince them, then you must be doing okay. But it's fair to say that the 1st century BC was a politically turbulent, not to mention violent time in Rome and Italy. If it's true that Lucretius was born in 94 BC, then around that time there was an extremely bloody war between Rome and its Italian allies. The 80s saw the civil war between Marius and Sulla, followed by the proscriptions, where political enemies of Sulla had their names posted in public and could be legally killed. And it's a really good thing that the President of the United States doesn't know anything about Roman history. The 70s saw the slave revolts of Spartacus. The 60s and 50s, political violence and street gangs in Rome, including a failed coup d'etat in 63 BC. The 40s, another civil war, this time between Caesar and Pompeii. And then yet another civil war in the 30s, Octavian versus Antony, until in 31 BC, Octavian is triumphant at the Battle of Actium and declares himself Augustus. And I understand Augustus is Mark Zuckerberg's favourite character from history. Now, if Augustus is Zuckerberg's hero, then Lucretius' hero was Epicurus. And Epicurus was a Greek. He was born in 341 BC on the island of Samos. And in 306 BC, in Athens, he established the Garden, which was a community of his followers, a school very much in the mould of Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum. And he died in 270 BC. He wrote over 40 works on physics and ethics, including a 37-book title on nature. And he based his atomic theory on the work of earlier philosophers, Leucippus and Democritus, both who were active in the 5th century BC. And the key features of Epicurus' atomic theory were as follows. Firstly, sense data is a reliable guide to reality. This is important because not all philosophers agree with that. Skeptics, for example, would say, how do you know that what you think is reality is really reality? In modern terms, how do you know you're not just a brain in a vat and an evil scientist is feeding your brain impulses that make you think you're sitting here in a lecture hall? Epicurus takes a very different view. If I see a cow, there is a cow. And the reason I know there's a cow is because my eyes can see it. So sense data is never wrong. It is the only and truest reliable guide to reality. It can be misinterpreted. So he takes up a very different position from the skeptics or the followers of Plato, who think that reality is actually an inferior copy of a sort of meta-reality elsewhere. He also feels that human beings naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain. Now, you would argue that this is a fairly uncontroversial position to take, but to be honest, it's the thing that bothers people about Epicureanism the most, because it gets misrepresented as hedonism, and people think that actually the Epicureans, and the modern word Epicurean, epicure, is all about seeking pleasure, particularly through food and gastronomy. If you remember Chaucer's Franklin, he lived for pleasure and had always done, for he was Epicurus' very son. So even by the time of Chaucer, Epicureans were being misrepresented in that way. And I say misrepresented because if you read Epicurus or Lucretius, it's clear that that's not what they're talking about. They're not talking about excessive luxurious pleasure. They're talking about sufficient pleasure to remove want or pain. So, it doesn't matter, you don't need the world's best food or the world's best wine. What you need is food and drink so you no longer feel hunger. And that's really relevant because, in fact, Epicurus kept his companions alive during a siege in 294 BC. Athens was under siege by a general of Alexander the Great called Demetrius the Besieger. Guess what he was good at? And it was a pretty terrible siege. There are stories about fathers and sons fighting each other for the right to eat mouse. Lucretius kept his companions alive during that time by rationing beans. So I think it's fair to say that the reception of Epicureanism as a hedonistic philosophy, which is also, by the way it's misrepresented by Romans, who weren't very keen on Epicurus either. They were much more interested in Stoic philosophy, isn't fair, either to Epicurus or his teachings. I've mentioned about keeping out of politics and public life. The universe consists of atoms in the void and is infinite. The gods do exist. So, Epicurus says there are gods, but they do not interfere with the world. They have nothing to do with us. And in fact, the state of the divine, where it doesn't really get involved in the affairs of the world, mirrors the ultimate state of enlightenment that Epicurus and his followers are looking for, which is ataraxia. And ataraxia means freedom from disturbance. Not dissimilar to some of the principles in Buddhism and the notion of enlightenment and freeing your mind from false beliefs that cause you unnecessary pain. But again, this is all contrary to, for example, the teachings of the Stoics, who were very popular in Rome at the time of Lucretius. So we talked about Lucretius's sayings, and there are two here, and I don't know if we've got any Greek speakers in the audience. Do we have any Greek speakers in the audience? Because you'll do this a lot better than I do. Great, so do you want to go for... KD1 stands for Kuriai Doxai, that's the sayings of the master, and this is number 1. So here we go, we've got a Greek speaker, off we go.
Would you want to read it?
Yes, that would be brilliant, thank you.
To makarion kai aftharton, ute auto pragmata eche, ute allo pareche, hoste ute orgais, ute carisi synechetai, and asthene gar pan toyuton.
Fantastic, round of applause. So this is the master saying number 1, the blessed and immortal neither has concerns itself nor provides them for another, and it is subject neither to feelings of anger nor to feelings of gratitude, i.e. organised religion is pointless. For all such is a mark of weakness. Right, anyone want to go at master saying number 2? Kuriai Doxai 2. Yeah, go for it.
Othantos uden os hermans, toga dieluthen, anais therte, to dan ais thretu uden os hermans.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So master saying number 2, death is nothing to us, for that which has perished lacks sensation. Remember, in Epicureanism, sensation is the only evidence of reality. If you're dead, you can't feel anything, and that which cannot be felt is nothing to us. So it's quite a radical philosophy. The sayings of the master contains a little hint there that Epicurus is a bit of a guru-like figure. He has disciples, he has master sayings that they need to learn off by heart. So there's a fair challenge to say, actually, is Epicureanism itself effectively a religion or a cult? In the same way, for example, that Freudianism can be accused of that. And there's an interesting bit of Lucretius, which I'd like us to look at now. So, we've got some Latin here. I'll have a go at this. So, Deus ille fuit, Deus inclute memi, qui princet vitae rationi venit, eam quae nunc appellator sapientia, quique per artem fluctibus et tantis vitam, tantis quae tenebris, in tam tranquil et tam clara luce locavit. Now, firstly, what on earth does that mean? He was a god indeed, my noble Memmius, who first discovered that rule of life, which is now called philosophy, who by his art rescued life from such a stormy sea, so black a night, and steered it into such a calm and sunlit haven. Now, there's quite a lot going on here, and that's why I've picked this bit for us to sort of really get into our first excerpt of Lucretian poetry. Firstly, there's some stuff here that's very standard. A lot of stuff about originality. Princeps, he was the first to do this, and we get that a lot, and you'll see it occurs later on whenever he's talking about Lucretius, which of course is slightly ironic because he wasn't the first. Democritus and Leucippus came before him, but that's by the by. Secondly, there is hymnic language. This sounds a little bit like a hymn. He was a god who did this, he was a god who did that. Our Father, who art in heaven, you who do this. So that is kind of a hymnic structure and hymnic language appropriate for a religion. The light imagery, bringing people out of darkness into light, again, is very common when Lucretius is talking about Epicurus. And Epicurus is not named. He was a god, the man who did this. And there's a really good name for this, but then there's a really easy way of explaining it. So let's do the easy way of explaining it first of all. You think about Voldemort in Harry Potter, he's not named. Why is he not named? Well, actually, the name for that device is reverential circumlocution, or if you prefer reverential periphrasis, it's up to you. But the key point is you do not name the great and mysterious figure, and you'll see that crops up later on. There's another reason not to name Epicurus, which is his name was not popular in Rome at the time. And Cicero, for example, in his speeches attacking Piso, uses Epicureanism as a weapon to undermine him. So there's another very practical reason to avoid the name. So that's all fairly straightforward. But I read you the translation, and it's a really good prose translation by Latham. but it misses so much. And there's a lovely Italian saying, which is traditori tradutori, translators, traitors. Poetry is what gets lost in translation. And in particular, I wanted to talk about some things that are going on in these 2 lines. Because believe it or not, even in the space of 2 lines, there are some pretty amazing things happening. So firstly, let's look at this line. You can see here, Wetam, the word for life. And remember, this line is all about life is beset on all sides by stormy waves and great darkness, and he rescues life from that and brings it safely home. Well, let's look at what life is surrounded by in this sentence. So it's surrounded by fluctibus tantis, such great waves, and tantis tenebris, such great darkness. So physically in the line, the waves and the darkness are encircling the word for life. So the word order and the word pattern conveys the meaning. Life is stranded in the middle, surrounded by all these threats. The alliteration of T points to turbulence, and there are 2 other things going on here which again give a notion of sort of turbulence and topsy-turviness. So firstly, we've got this word A or X. Any Latin students in the audience, A or X is an example of what part of speech?
Preposition.
It's a preposition, very good. So if it's a preposition, what's it doing not going in front of the word? Because the word preposition means something that goes in front of a word. This is a preposition that is postponed. And a postponed preposition is in the wrong place. Why is it in the wrong place? Because this is a disordered and chaotic line. Second point.
It's like scanning, isn't it? It scans into...
Yeah. Well, actually, you can say that it needs to be there for reasons of rhythm, but there are other ways of writing the line where you could get A in front of fluctibus, so that would be okay. So I think there's a deeper reason it's there. The alliteration of T we talked about, there's something else going on, which is this. You look at the pattern of fluctibus tantis, tantis tenebris. So noun, tantis, which means so great, tantis, which means so great, tenebris. So it goes A, B, B, A. And that pattern has a name, it's called a chiasmus. There it is, called a chiasmus. And the reason is, if you write it out, A, B, B, A, and join the A's and join the B's, it makes the Greek letter chi. And that crisscrossing pattern, again, implies a sort of topsy-turviness. So that line is topsy-turvy, it's chaotic, it's noisy. Fluctibus tantis, vitam tantis quae tenebris. The alliteration of T, it's a noisy, chaotic, disordered line where life, plural life, is stranded in the middle of all of that. And then what does Lucretius do, what does Epicurus do in the next line? In tam tranquil et tam clara luce locavit. Now the sound of that line is completely different. The alliteration of T is ordered, and we have an alliteration of L at the end, bringing life into that sort of safe haven, that safe and calm and bright, sunny haven. And the rhythm of that line is very different. In tam tranquil et tam clara luce locavit. That line is pretty much as long, as spondaic as it could be. Remember I said you've got 2 options in the musical parts of Latin poetry. You can either have long, long, or long, short, short. That's as long as it can be, and it gives that sort of gentle, calming effect as Epicurus brings life home and brings it into a tam tranquillo, so calm, tam clara, so bright, a luce, a place. And there's a little sailing metaphor there as well, with locavit. None of that you can get in translation. That's why you need to learn languages in the original. That said, Epicurus is not an immortal god. And interestingly, the only time he's named in De Rerum Natura is in Book 3, when Lucretius is saying, even Epicurus died. So the only time he's named is the point at which he's saying, we all die. But it is fair to say Lucretius' choice of poetry as a vehicle for Epicurean philosophy is both paradoxical and unorthodox. It's paradoxical because the use of poetry, especially metaphor, as a vehicle for philosophy is something the Epicureans condemned. They viewed figurative language as an unacceptable medium for philosophical discourse. Epicurus, in his letter to Herodotus, says that words should be used in their most obvious meanings, and it's something Philodemus, and he's somebody we're going to talk about later on, also criticises. So if Epicureans are saying words should be used in their primary meanings and figurative language should be avoided, how do we justify Lucretius' choice of poetry to convey this? So if the choice of poetry was a controversial choice for philosophy, it's fair to say that philosophy was not a controversial choice for poetry. And particularly didactic poetry, sometimes called catalogue poetry. Now, I'd love to tell you that catalogue poetry originated in Argos. But I'm afraid it didn't. It originated in Boeotia with the poet Hesiod in the 7th century, who composed 2 poems, one, the Theogony, which was a sort of cosmic history of the universe and the gods, and the originally named Aeoi. Never read the Aeoi, it's the dullest poem in history. Every line begins, or like the woman who, and in Greek that is Aeoi. So don't go anywhere near that. Catalogue poetry at its worst. 5th century BC saw a poem on physics, Periphuseos, by Empedocles. And Empedocles is another good reason not to believe biographers about how people die. In Empedocles' Periphuseos on physics, he regards fire as the main element of the universe. And surprise, surprise, how the biographers tell us he died. They tell us that he fell into a volcano. I don't know how you do that. It was Mount Etna. You're not wandering through Sicily and accidentally fall into Mount Etna, but there we are. In the 3rd century BC, there was an extremely popular poem on astronomy by Aratus called The Phenomena, and that's very relevant because it was massively popular in Rome at the time of Lucretius. There were several translations of it from Greek into Latin. Cicero even wrote a commentary on it, and it was the sort of, the hit of that time. Less of a hit was Nicander in the 2nd century BC. Again, if you're bored or sleepless at night, the Alexipharmaca, which is a cure for different kinds of snake bites and poisons, will do the job. It's certainly a cure for insomnia. So how can we justify Lucretius' choice of poetry to communicate his philosophy? Well, fortunately, Lucretius himself does it for us. And I'm going to read you an extract of this now. This is from the verse translation by Melville, and it's taken from Book 1, where Lucretius tries to explain why it's okay to use poetry for Epicurean philosophy. Come now. Oh, hang on. No, that's the wrong. Yeah, no, that's. Yeah, that's right. So, come now and learn what follows and listen to it. I know how dark these matters are, but the high hope of fame has struck my heart sharply with holy wand and filled my breast with sweet love of the muses. Thus inspired with mind and purpose flourishing and free, a pathless country of the Pierides I traverse, where no foot has ever trod. A joy it is to come to virgin springs and drink. A joy it is to pluck new flowers to make a glorious garland for my head from fields whose blooms the muses never picked to crown the brows of any man before. First, since of matters high I make my theme, proceeding to set free the minds of men bound by the tight knots of religion. Next, since of things so dark in verse so clear I write, and touch all things with the muses' charm. In this no lack of purpose may be seen. For as with children, when doctors try to give them loathsome wormwood, first they smear sweet yellow honey on the goblet's rim, that childhood, all unheeding, may be deceived at the lips' edge, and so drink up the juice of bitter medicine, tricked but not betrayed, and by such means gain health and strength again. So now do I, for oft my doctrine seems distasteful to those who have not sampled it, and must shrink back from it. My purpose is with the sweet voices of Pierian song, to expound my doctrine, and as it were to touch it with the delicious honey of the muses. So in this way, perchance, my poetry can hold your mind while you attempt to grasp the nature of the world and understand the great design and pattern of its making. Now actually, most commentators who talk about this passage talk about the second half, which is the analogy with the honey and the wormwood. For those of you who don't know, wormwood is a medicinal plant, still used today, and actually a byproduct of wormwood is vermouth and absinthe, not for children. And that medicinal purpose of the poetry is echoed in Epicurus. So Epicurus, fragment 54, says, "Vain is the word of a philosopher, which does not heal any suffering of man. For just as there is no profit in medicine, if it does not dispel the diseases of the body, so there is no profit in philosophy either, if it does not expel the suffering of the mind." And interestingly, the first four of Epicurus' master sayings, particularly the attack on fear of death and fear of the gods, was called the Tetrapharmakos, the Fourfold Cure. which again is a clear medical metaphor. What people don't really talk about is the first half of that passage though, so I'd like to go back to that. So I think we're clear about, the poetry is there to keep you interested while the philosophy does its work, and philosophy is bitter and unpalatable, but you won't notice because of the sweet poetry, a bit like children. But the first bit people don't talk about as much, and they really should, because alarm bells start to ring whenever any Roman poet starts talking about visiting a mountain of the Muses, treading paths that no one has trod before, drinking from springs that no one has drunk from before, and garlanding their head with flowers that have never been used. And the reason that should ring massive alarm bells for anyone is it is a very, very clear reference to a Greek poet and librarian called Callimachus, who was in charge of the library at Alexandria, actually. And Callimachus was possibly the most influential Greek figure on Roman poetry of the 1st century BC. And if you read the books on this, all of them talk about the way in which poets like Virgil, Horace, Propertius, Tibullus, Ovid reference this section. One of them is from Callimachus' Aetia, and the other one is his hymn to Apollo. But there are kind of key markers which are the paths that have not been trod before, drinking from the pure spring that nobody's drunk from before, the flowers that you pick and you garland. And if it was anyone else, people would be jumping up and down saying, oh, this is an allusion to Callimachus and Callimachian aesthetics, which were popular in 1st century BC Rome. But because it's Lucretius, no one ever talks about it. And they forget that he got there first, if we think the chronology can be believed. There's also a nice little play on words, which is to do with setting free the minds of men bound by the tight knots of religion. And that is a play on words because the word religio, if you want to do it etymologically, can be to do with tying something back, tying something down. So there's a little play on words there about releasing people from the bonds of superstition. So that's one reason why Lucretius is justified in using poetry. It keeps people interested in the philosophy, and by the way, it justifies his poetic achievement and puts him on a level with some of the people who are more famous. But there's a second reason, which is he needs to use imagery and analogy for a really practical reason, and that's that atoms are invisible. And this contradicts sensory data. So if you're sort of saying, well, the sense data is the only way of judging the world, why should I believe you that they're atoms? I can't see them. So what's that about? And again, there's a very nice passage where Lucretius comes up with a very memorable analogy, and you'll see how effective this is. He says, he's talking about the movement of atoms. Consider sunbeams. When the sun's rays, let in, pass through the darkness of a shuttered room, you will see a multitude of tiny bodies, all mingling in a multitude of ways inside the sunbeam, moving in the void, and seeming to be engaged in endless strife, battle and warfare, troop attacking troop, and never a respite, harried constantly, with meetings and with partings everywhere. From this, you can imagine what it is for atoms to be tossed perpetually in endless motion through the mighty void. To some extent, a small thing may afford an image of great things, a footprint of a concept. I think that's a great phrase, a footprint of a concept. A further reason why you should give your mind to the bodies you see dancing in a sunbeam is that their dancing shows that within matter, secret and hidden motions also lie. For many you will see are struck by blows unseen, and changing course are driven back, reversed on all sides, here, there, everywhere. These wandering movements, you may be sure, are caused in every case by atoms. Atoms first move of themselves. Next, bodies that are formed in a small group and nearest to the force of the primal atoms are set moving by them, driven by unseen blows from them, and they attack in turn bodies a little larger, and the movement thus ascends from primal atoms and comes out gradually up to our senses, and thus it is that those bodies also move that we can see in sunbeams, though the blows that make them do it are invisible. Now what's pretty remarkable about this is that Lucretius is pretty clearly describing what in 1827 came to be known as Brownian Motion. And Brownian Motion was first observed microscopically in 1827 and only explained by Einstein in 1905. But here's Lucretius in the 1st century BC with this really memorable analogy of dust particles in the sunbeam that prove the invisible collisions that you can't see. And the other use of poetry is for pure impressive power. And this is possibly my favourite bit of Lucretius. So, this, we're not going to read all of this, you'll be relieved to hear. But this is Lucretius talking about the achievement of Epicurus. And we're going to zoom in on some things in a minute. When human life lay grovelling in all men's sight, crushed to the earth under the dead weight of superstition, whose grim features lowered menacingly upon mortals from the four quarters of the sky, a man of Greece was first to raise mortal eyes in defiance, first to stand erect and brave the challenge. Fables of the gods did not crush him, nor the lightning flash and the growling menace of the sky. Rather, they quickened his manhood, so that he, first of all men, longed to smash the constraining locks of nature's doors. The vital vigour of his mind prevailed, and he ventured far out beyond the flaming ramparts of the world, and voyaged in mind throughout infinity. Returning victorious, he proclaimed to us what can be and what cannot, how a limit is fixed to the power of everything and an immovable frontier post. Therefore, superstition in its turn lies crushed beneath his feet, and we, by his triumph, are lifted level with the skies. Now, there's quite a lot going on here, but some of the key features. So the achievement of Epicurus is described in terms of a battle, if you like, between gods and giants. What's interesting about that is the giants in ancient literature are the archetypes of impiety, and impiety was a charge often levelled against Epicureans because they didn't believe the gods interfered with the world. So it reverses that imagery. Instead of being the impious, god-killing giant, monster, Epicurus is taking on the impious monster of religion. Notice again the avoidance of his name, Epicurus Homo, a man of Greece. But then there's some other things going on, one of which is slightly postmodern. I think I now buy this. I didn't buy this when I was an undergraduate. I'd be interested to see how many of you did. And it's to do with this line here. So, quae caput arcae religionibus ostendebat. And this is talking about religion showing its menacing face from all quarters of the sky. And if you look really carefully here, cae religionibus, there is an anagram of religio just there, liregio. And what that's saying is that religio is indeed showing portions of its face, arcae regionibus. So from the word that means from the regions of the sky, there's an internal anagram of the word religio. Now, when I was an undergraduate, I thought, no, not buying that at all, that's too beardy-weirdy for me. Actually, now I think, especially as hipsters, are quite common, and it's less weird. I'm coming round to it. And it's up to you whether you believe that or not, but it's just a thought. We've got some really obvious things that jump out at us. The emphasis again on Epicurus' originality, primum primus. The really strong and emphatic repetition of contra here. You know, this is a philosophy that takes on the established order. This is very strong to have these words repeated in the end of the line, which is the emphatic position of the line. And then these two lines are really interesting if you listen to the sound. Quem neque fama deum, nec fulmina, nec militanti mumere compressit caelum. Really strong alliteration of M. Now again, if this were Virgil, people would be jumping up and down saying, oh yeah, alliteration of M conveys the rumbling thunder and the growling from the sky. But because it's Lucretius, nobody wants to talk about it. So that really strong alliteration of M conveys the sort of menacing thunder from the sky that Epicurus didn't let put him off, and off he went. Primus there again for the originality, but it's these two lines that are just stunning. Ergo vivida vis animi pervicet et extra, processit longe flammantia moenia mundi, at quomni mensum peragravit mentanimoque. So therefore the vital vigour of his mind prevailed and advanced far beyond the flaming walls of the world. Incredible image. At quomni mensum peragravit, and roamed through all infinity. At quomni mensum, because these end in vowels and the next word starts in vowels, they're elided. So they run in together, giving that sense of sort of roaming through infinity. At quomni mensum peragravit, with his mind and his heart. And then brought back the news that was his victory. Incredible stuff. I'm going to skip that bit, because I think we're quite short of time. So, here we go. So I think Lucretius' choice of poetry was successful, not least because, let's face it, it is the only detailed account of atomism to survive, and that is testament to the power of his poetry. Lucretius is the master of metaphor, And the reason that's relevant is some recent research that's been done in cognitive neuroscience with MRI scans shows that metaphors have a very unusual and very powerful impact on the brain. So when you hook people up to MRI scanners and look at what metaphors do, they light up areas of your brain in really impactful and meaningful ways. So metaphor is really powerful as a communication tool. Okay, so next bit. We're nearly there. Anyone been to Pompeii? Great. Anyone been to Herculaneum? Always that ratio. So Pompeii, brilliant. Herculaneum, if you haven't been, you must go, and here's why. So firstly, I think we know about Pompeii and Herculaneum. Both cities destroyed in the eruption, AD 79, the eruption of Vesuvius. Vesuvius should erupt every 50 years on average. It hadn't erupted for hundreds of years, and that caused a pyroclastic eruption. Pyroclastic eruptions are very bad news. Lava's brilliant because lava moves slowly and knocks down buildings. Pyroclastic surges are bad because they leave buildings untouched and kill people. And when I used to take classics tours to Pompeii, because I took teenagers, you can guess what teenagers' first question is. Sir, will the volcano erupt when we're there? and I always say, well, I don't think that's likely. There is a monitoring station on Vesuvius. It monitors all the seismic activity. And you know, my risk assessment says we probably shouldn't go if it's looking dangerous. And the Naples traffic, don't even get me started. But then they would say, but sir, what if it goes up when we're there? And because this was before keeping children safe in education, and people could say incautious things, I used to smile at them and say, well, actually, if it erupts when we're on the mountain, it's dead easy. All you do is, if it's a lava eruption, you just walk slowly to the bottom of the mountain and admire the lava sort of passing you by, glowing, incredible stuff. You can run away from lava. If it's a pyroclastic surge, all you need to do is adopt a really unusual position so that when archaeologists find you in 200 years, you might make it into the next book of the Cambridge Latin course. And the reason for this is this pyroclastic surge is 400 degrees hot, which for context is the temperature on the surface of the planet Mercury. It moves at 80 kilometers an hour. And it's very destructive of life. Herculaneum had a very unusual experience because there was minimal pumice fall because of the wind direction, so most of the pumice went to Pompeii, and that meant the roofs caved in and most of the bodies we found were on top of the pumice layer. There wasn't much pumice at Herculaneum, but there was thick pyroclastic mud, and that did two really useful things. Firstly, it holds up buildings, so Herculaneum has way more second-story, three-story buildings than you find at Pompeii. And the other thing it does is it preserves wood, and that's going to be really relevant because it creates an anaerobic seal that preserves wood. We'll talk about that shortly. So, let's have a look at Pompeii first of all. And you're probably familiar with these. These are Fiorelli molds. Fiorelli was one of the supervising excavators of Pompeii, and they kept noticing they were coming across cavities. And the cavities were where people had died, and then surrounding material formed around them. The body had decayed and left a skeleton and cavity, but they worked out that if you pour plaster into the cavity, you could recreate the body at the time of death. And these are in the garden of the Fugitives in Pompeii, and these are pretty typical. So most of the people you find in Pompeii are sort of covering their mouths because they're being suffocated and it took a long time for them to die, or they're straining up to try and gasp for air and get more air. And so those are pretty typical of what you find at Pompeii. But what people noticed early on was you don't find any of those at Herculaneum. And when I was at school, we were told everyone at Herculaneum got away. Herculaneum was by the sea. It was a seaside resort for ultra high net worth villas. And we were told everyone got away. And at my comprehensive school, we thought typical, rich guys got away, whereas poor people of Pompeii suffered. Unfortunately, when Herculaneum was better excavated, they found their way down to the ship sheds. And in the ship sheds was where the entire population they'd fled to the ship sheds to be rescued. And these are skeletons, no Fiorelli molds here, no cavities. The difference here is their death would have been very quick. 400 degrees C, 80 miles an hour. The pyroclastic wind was strong enough to sterilize teeth, so the teeth of these skeletons have no bacteria, and the chances are that many of them, the brain exploded straight away because of the intense heat. So it's quick, but that's where they all are. So it's quite spooky. It's down in the ship sheds if you go. But the reason I want to talk to you about Herculaneum is to do with something, a villa that was discovered kind of by accident in 1750. We think the owner could have been somebody called Lucretius Piso. I mentioned him earlier. He was Caesar's father-in-law, patron of Philodemus. Philodemus was that popular Epicurean philosopher and poet, and he was a consul. Some people think it was his son, some people think it was a friend of Cicero, but it doesn't really matter. The villa you can get a really good sense of by going to Malibu. And this is the J.P. Getty Museum in Malibu, which is a reconstruction of the villa, because that's what Americans do. And it's a pretty good reconstruction, actually. Now, I'm deliberately not giving you the name of the villa, because if I do, it gives away the answer to the next question. Any ideas what that is?
A scroll.
It's a scroll, good. The archaeologists who excavated it thought it was wood initially, because they look like lumps of wood or charcoal, and the Herculaneum, you find lots of wood. But actually what this is a carbonized papyrus scroll. And we're back to the beginning of the talk now about books. This is a book. It's in a scroll form. It's carbonized. It's black ink on now black paper, quite hard to read, on the world's most fragile paper. So if you try and unwrap it, it just crumbles to dust. And people have been using all sorts of ingenious techniques to try and unwrap these things. Indeed, there's a really nice imaging technique now using medical scanners that means you don't even need to unwrap them. It's called virtual unwrapping. And you scan the papyrus roll, and then it virtually unwraps it, and you can start to reconstruct the text. And the reason is that these all come from the Villa of the Papyri. Now, the reason the Villa of the Papyri is so exciting is this. We know that nothing there is post-79 AD, because we have a very clear stratigraphy. The place was destroyed in 79 AD. So everything there must be pre-79 AD. That early text of Lucretius I showed you came from the 9th century AD, so 800 and something AD. Hundreds and hundreds of years after Lucretius wrote his poem. Copies of copies, errors of errors, terrible. No printing press, obviously. But the texts at the Villa of the Papyri are originals. And at the Villa of the Papyri we have fragments of, we have books, we have bits of Epicurus on nature, lots of Philodemus. His philosophical works aren't great, because he doesn't like metaphor, but his romantic poems are quite good. And we have a little bit of Lucretius, and that's really tantalizing, because it's the earliest Latin literature that we have. Now the big problem here is, only the Greek library's been excavated, and this sort of gives a bit of a conundrum. The site superintendents of Pompeii and Herculaneum are very worried. They're worried that they do not have the money or the skill to keep those sites preserved. The damage those sites are getting, both from the environment and from attrition of tourists, means that it wasn't that long ago people were considering reburying Pompeii as the most economical solution to preserving it. And it's only the fact that the Italian government can't afford to do that, because it's a massive money spinner, that it's up there. But every time I go back to Pompeii, another house has fallen down, something else has been damaged. And Herculaneum is worse, A, because not many people go, so it's got less money. It's by the sea, so there's worse erosion. And it's in terrible shape. I mean, they are absolutely collapsing around our ears. There isn't the funding or the will to preserve them. But on the flip side, if we were to excavate the Latin library of the Villa of the Papyri, because we've only done the Greek one, if we excavated the Latin library, what else might be there? And so this is the sort of the dilemma, really. The pro of excavating it is, I mean, imagine knowing there was a library that contained all the missing plays of Shakespeare in his autograph hand. You'd want to open that library, wouldn't you? But the con is, what if you knew you didn't have the money or the skill or the influence to preserve it for posterity? And there was a serious risk that you would actually lose it and it would be damaged forever. Now, at the minute, people in charge of Herculaneum have left it there, and their reasoning is, let's just wait, and in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, maybe people will have better techniques, either for scanning without digging up, or for preserving what they have dug up. And I think that's probably the sensible approach, but it's really frustrating for me, because I'm pretty sure there's a lot of Lucretius down there, there's a lot of other stuff down there, in texts ridiculously early. I mean, the earliest manuscript of Virgil is 4th century AD. There could be some stuff in there that's 1st century AD, 1st century BC. Could even be originals, autographs. Incredible. So summary, because I'm finished. I think there's a huge irony in the immortality of Lucretius and his text. For somebody who writes that death is the end, everything's gone, we're still talking about him, here we are today, we've all come here tonight to talk about him, and I think it's ironic that for a poem that is talking about the certainty of death, it nevertheless immortalised its poet and its topic. And if Herculaneum is right, there might be a text in there as well. And something so destructive like the eruption of Vesuvius actually could have preserved and saved those texts. I believe that Lucretius was way ahead of his time as a poet and as a scientist. In fact, I would compare him with Da Vinci in his use of everyday observation and the application of that to his art and his science. And I hope from this lecture it's become clear why I chose to study classics at university. For me, classics is the ultimate subject. There is no subject that combines language, literature, philosophy, history, art, archaeology, linguistics in the way that classics does. One possible derivation of the word classics is from the Byzantine klisica, which means a selection of all the things you should know to regard yourself as an educated human being. Thank you.